Hello and welcome to The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James. I'm the actor.
My name is Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer. And we
Here we
will
go.
be talking about First Man. Because
Okay.
I waited, but then you didn't say anything, so I just picked right back up and kept, moving forward.
No, I'm making sure the introduction is exactly how you want it to be.
Oh, jeez. Here we
I get
go.
it.
Here we go.
I like it. No, I like it. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I'm not joking you.
We can change it up every once in a while or every time, and that way nobody knows what to expect.
Now it's becoming a pattern that we talk about not changing it up. So that's going to have to be part of the introduction now because that would make it normal. Anyway, let's move on. Here we go.
We just have an extended intro now, talking about why our intro is extended. It's very meta. We're so 2018. It's amazing.
Alrighty then.
So we get to talk about a Damien Chazelle movie. So I'm really excited. And it's been a little while since I've seen it, but I was really excited to hear that he was making another movie so quickly after La La Land, and excited to hear that Ryan Gosling was going to be a part of it. So it was really cool to see this movie. I saw it a couple weeks ago, and I wanted to see it again in IMAX, but I wasn't able to. When did you see it?
No, last week.
Okay.
Monday of last week. It's been a little while, but I had to get it in. And my father didn't want to see it at first, and I kind of had a little resistance to it. Not a resistance to the movie, just nothing about the film was calling me. And I knew that, Damien Chazelle, Ryan Gosling, I knew how bad could it be, but there's just something about it. I guess I was trapped in yet another astronaut movie, and I was not willing to open my mind to the fact that this might be something different than that. And I was completely wrong. It is something different than that. And both of us highly enjoyed it, and we found it fascinating. We talked about it all night long, the whole ride home and the rest of the night. And as a matter of fact, I had to kind of rev my dad up to go see it. Now, we go see big popcorn movies. We saw Meg, and we saw The Avengers, and we see these big epic films. We saw Solo together. So usually we're seeing these action adventure films, for lack of a better term. And he was like, yeah, I'm not that interested in this movie. After the film, the first thing he said was, well, I'm glad I went to that. And I was like, yeah, me too. So it turned out to be a different experience than I was expecting it to be. But it was last week, a week ago, Monday.
But so for me, at least, it's stuck with me watching the movie and just thinking about it. And, especially like listening to the score afterwards and just thinking about the choices that Damien Chazelle made and how he did make it different than, Apollo 13 Part 2, or, hey, let's do exactly what Ron Howard did, or, hey, let's do From the Earth to the Moon, but in a movie form. He made, I think he made it was a bold choice, number one, but it was also a smart choice to differentiate this movie from other movies. And I'm wondering if that's that had to be what drew him to this project, because he was, a part of this project. He had this in the works before La La Land was done. And in fact, they had the screenplay writer, Josh Singer. It's based on a book that was written by James R. Hansen, like a biography written by James R. Hansen, but somebody bought the rights to it and the movie rights to it, and brought in Josh Singer pre-Spotlight fame. So, I mean, I don't know if he'd written Spotlight before or not, but he hadn't gotten his Oscar for Spotlight yet when he signed on to this movie. So you get, Josh Singer probably for a great deal money-wise, because he's not an Oscar winner yet. And you get Damien Chazelle probably for a good deal, because he's not an Oscar winner yet too. And they're interested enough to, make this what it is. And the bold choice that they made was to really focus on not only the most expansive things you could think of, space and, a whole nother celestial body, the moon and all of that, but just to focus on one person, one man and his family, and what he's going through personally, also at the same time having to take on a lot of responsibilities and stress, and and have enough resolve to go through all that and to live through that without just completely breaking apart. So that's interesting to me. The other thing that was interesting to me is the fact that we don't know a lot about Neil Armstrong. I mean, I remember like learning that Neil Armstrong was the first man to step foot on the moon when I was a little kid, but that's all I can tell you about him, before I saw this movie. So whereas Buzz Aldrin, his counterpart in that mission, is a little bit more outspoken and in the spotlight a little more because he was willing to talk about things and willing to throw in his opinion on things. And so whereas Neil Armstrong was always a very private and personal person. So that I thought was interesting to focus on him specifically, and I think they had a good story to tell, especially with how the movie starts with it's not a spoiler, with the death of his daughter.
Yes, I agree with everything that you said. I find it interesting that we don't know much about this person, and then this movie comes along, because I'm thinking to myself, why are they focusing on one person? Why is it not about the space race and all that other stuff? It is definitely owed to Damien Chazelle and the screen play writer Josh Singer, in the fact that it is a movie that is master of subtlety. There is so much subtlety in this film, and if you're talking about a movie about astronauts going to the moon, subtlety is not the word I would necessarily use on any level to describe any of the movies up to this point that we've seen. So, yes, it's very interesting to know something about this person. It's devastating to find out what this man's story is, and it's also interesting to find and see a person who is motivated by something that's not clear throughout the whole entire movie. And at the end of the movie, I go, why did he do what he did? Why was he interested in what he was interested in? Why did he want to do this? You don't hear, or they don't explain a lot of that. You kind of have to put that together yourself. There's a scene in the very beginning of the film when he's trying to figure out what to do with his daughter and the new treatment for his daughter, and he's talking to somebody on a phone, and you take it that it's a doctor or a hospital or somebody, and he says something, well, what about this treatment? I heard about this treatment, blah, blah, and he's trying to figure out what the next step is to help his daughter. And it's actually a very quick scene. It's shot from the back of Ryan Gosling. You see him at this desk. It's not anything over the top or anything to go, listen, you need to pay attention to this moment, audience. But yet, if you really listen very closely, it's all there. And I was super excited that I think I figured out for myself, let alone maybe for the film, why he does what he does. And if it's not what other people think, that's fine. It's my interpretation lit me up, because I was like, it's all right there, and you don't see it until you actually see it. But yeah, this film, it has a way of speaking such truth without pounding it over your head. And everything that a director or screenwriter should be doing when it comes to astronauts and space race and family drama, they're not. They do the polar opposite of everything in this film, with the exception of one shot when they're walking to the capsule, when they're finally going on the mission, and you see that they come out of the elevator and they got their little like suitcases or whatever, I guess oxygen, I don't know what that is, and their helmets are on, and it's slow motion, and they're walking in their little suits and stuff like that, their big suits. That's the only cliche shot of astronauts in this film. Everything else, from the very beginning, is shot from the person's point of view. The whole opening sequence is shot out of what, 5x7 window? I mean, and the rattling of the metal, and you can hear the crinking of things being strained, and what it would have been like being in, I guess, a cockpit. I don't know what that's called.
Yeah, he's in a plane.
But you don't ever see an epic opening to a space drama where it's nothing but a little window. Brilliant. That's brilliant, because it readjusts your thought process. You go, this is not going to be what you think it should be.
Yeah, and you're right. I think that's visually how he's able to differentiate his movie from The Right Stuff, From the Earth to the Moon, Apollo 13, all those kind of space, traditional space movies where you're such a close shot on, Ryan Gosling in that X-15, because it's not a space capsule or anything like that. It is a plane. It's a rocket plane that they drop out of another plane, and because they don't want to have to spend the fuel to get it up to that elevation, to that height. So they drop it from there, they fire the rocket, and then he's able to climb from there. But the fact that, like you said, you're in this plane, which is probably very similar to what he experienced, where it's only held on by, a few clamps and things. The only thing that's keeping that plane from falling, at any moment are a few clamps, and it's shaking and shuddering as the plane is moving, and you're hearing all of those shakes and shudders. And the other thing they did was they locked the camera to the plane itself, so the camera is shaking and he is shaking. Ryan Gosling's shaking separate from the camera, so you get a lot of this like side to side motion where it's kind of tearing the image, and it's unsettling. And especially once he moves up, once his plane starts, when they drop it and it starts to go, and he starts to climb into the stratosphere and the all ionosphere and all that stuff, and kind of try to get close to the edge of the the Earth, then you start to feel all of that, the shaking and the kind of like claustrophobia, and you get to see those images in his eyes. One of the ways they did that, or the main way they did that, was they had this huge like 35-foot screen that was like a big, for lack of a better word, like rear projection. It was an LED screen, but they rendered all of the CGI graphics in those scenes, and they had them playing out of this. It's very similar to what they did in Interstellar. So where they played all that out, and it came through the windows of the cockpit of his plane. So, and they had the plane on a gimbal. They did the same thing for each of the capsule scenes, whether it's Gemini or Apollo. And so you're not only able to see the light properly exposing on him, but you're also able to see things like reflections of what he's seeing in his eyeballs, because there's a lot of really close shots. And the other thing they're doing is they're shooting it with like small stock film. So they're shooting it with Super 16 millimeter film. A lot of that, I think that whole first scene was shot, because that was the first thing I noticed. Was I was like, this is really grainy. Like, it's really grainy, and that's on purpose. And I think for multiple reasons, probably so they can integrate in old footage and make it seem seamless, because I know that they integrated in some actual NASA archive footage, and then so that they can also give it, a kind of like a period feel too, because that's what, things might have been shot in Super 16 and all those different things. I did like a really deep dive into like film stocks, because I listened to a Damien Chazelle interview, and he talked about all the different formats they used, because they shot in IMAX too. Like when they're on the moon, they shot, spoiler, they made it to the moon. So when they shot on the moon, they shot all the moon footage with IMAX cameras. So like 70 millimeter, huge format, beautiful, high resolution, all of that on the moon. But especially at the beginning, that's all Super 16. And they also used 35 millimeter film. But there's different ways that you can shoot that film, different ways you can set up the cameras. So they call it 2-perf, 3-perf, and 4-perf. Do you know on film, on a piece of film, if you've seen that, they have the sprocket holes on the sides?
Yeah.
Those are called perforations or perfs. So there's different formats you can shoot using different lenses. A lot of movies that still shoot on film are 4-perf films, where the image has 4 holes on either side for each image. But if you shoot 3-perf or 2-perf, you're reducing the size of the film that's being exposed per frame. And it does a couple things. It makes it a lot cheaper, because a 4-perf image can now be 2-perf images, which is awesome when you're trying to save money. But the problem is when you blow that up to a 35 millimeter print, then it becomes more grainy. It becomes grainier. One of the first people to do that was Sergio Leone in Good and the Bad and the Ugly. So he did that, really wide 2.4 1 aspect ratio, like the CinemaScope aspect ratio type thing, and made it look really wide, and that made all the eyes look really cool at the end of Good, Bad, and the Ugly, but it also made them look really grainy. But it was a way for him to save money. So in this movie, they utilized all of those different technologies, and were still able to make it look grainy when they wanted to make it look grainy, and make it look grainy, not artificially, but because that's the way they shot on the film. So that all of that was really, really interesting to me. And it's amazing how we talked about this with A Star Is Born, where you're able to use technology to put forth an image that is able to represent an emotion. And they didn't just use these different technologies, these different film stocks for fun. There's reasons behind that. And even if it doesn't necessarily translate to like, ooh, that's too perf, nobody's really going to know that. And I didn't like feel that in my bones when I saw it, but knowing that they're taking that kind of care with how they're exposing the image and how they're running it through the process. I mean, that's really cool to me. And it goes to show you that you have all of these tools at your disposal, and you might as well use them.
Well, you remember a long time ago we talked about the reason to keep film around, because in the digital age, and I said it was just like keeping an old car around. You're never going to know exactly what a 1960 VW Beetle looked like unless you have one. I mean, yes, you have pictures, and yes, you have people who have knowledge of that, but there's no reason to not keep that around when you might need that in a film. Same with costumes, same with makeup, same with lighting, all of the above. And the idea that you can recreate it in digital is a possibility, but at the same time, if you want that actual, what did you call it, 16 millimeter? What was
Super
it?
16, yeah. 16 millimeters, the really, really grainy stuff, yeah.
Yeah, and so you either do it on that or you try to digitally create that. And I'm guessing they probably can digitally create that, but just like anything in the computer world, there's an instinct we have as human beings that's not entirely true or real. Even though we accept the image of a dinosaur eating a human being, we know somewhere deep down inside it's not 100% real. And when we can't figure out the difference is when the CGI is done exceptionally well. So it begs the question, why get rid of film? If you're going to utilize it like Damien Chazelle does, then there's no reason to get rid of it. And you're right, it does give you this perspective of the time. This is what this would have looked like in that time. And also it allows the audience to start to date the film in their mind's eye. You go, this is not a modern take on this. And I don't have any problem with filming something in digital to make it look as crisp and clear as you want it to be and still film it in a period. I don't have a problem with that, but there is something that feels very organic when you actually utilize what you had to use in that time frame. So I think it's smart what he did. And it also, it goes back to something I'll repeat a couple of times throughout this podcast. It's very subtle, but it's so right in your face. But yet, unless you really register what's happening, you actually think you're just watching film from the 1960s or the late 50s, early 60s. You might not know that this is a modern day film. And then it's there, but not there. That's what I'm finding amazing about this film. His choices are sometimes the polar opposite of what you're expecting. Because why would you not want to film Ryan Gosling in this great epic flight scene in the clearest view you could?
Yeah.
Because you're not telling the story the way that you want to tell it. So he does the opposite of what is expected of him, and he goes back to the original idea of using film that you could use in that time frame. I think it's great. I think it's organic, and I think it's subtle, and I think it adds to the storytelling process. It just doesn't make it look cool. It doesn't make it look like it's from the 1960s. It adds to the actual narrative of the story. That's what's important to me. And he does it all the way throughout this movie.
Yeah, and I think that, the first scene we see is the X-15, test flight, but then after that, we start getting into his family life and his relationship with his wife, and especially his relationship with his daughter. before she passes, and then also, the immediate like after effects of that. And I think all of that, I mean, I'm not sure, but I think all of that is also shot Super 16 because it does have that really grainy look, and there's a lot of like really close shots, like we're hanging like right around whoever, whether it's Claire Foy's head or Ryan Gosling's head. We're kind of hanging right around that. And by the way, Claire Foy, I don't think I've seen her in anything, but I know she's famous for the Crown, for playing the Queen in The Crown. Have you seen her in anything?
I have not. This is my first exposure to her. I know her name because of The Crown, and I know that she's won a couple of awards, and that's how I know her name. But no, this is the first time I've ever seen her that I put name to face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think she did a great job. I think that her character might have been underwritten a little bit, but I think that, I mean, it's hard to balance all those things, but she does get a few scenes without Ryan Gosling, whether it's usually interacting with other wives, other like astronaut wives. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of a hard task right there, because she's having to be she's playing, a homemaker. She's playing I don't know what the proper verbiage is nowadays, but she's playing
Mother.
I know it's a mother, but she doesn't have a profession that causes her to not be around her children, and she's having to be at home with and be the support structure for Neil Armstrong, who is emotionally maybe closed off a little bit, or emotionally keeps his emotions close to the vest. So that's got to be difficult to handle, and difficult to play as an actress, because she doesn't. There's no like huge blow up fights. There's not a lot. I mean, there's like one-ish, but where she kind of confronts him right before one of his missions. But there's really not a lot there as for her to play off of. So it's got to be difficult to do. But I think she does a good job. So we've got those scenes between them, especially at the beginning, where we're kind of close together with them, and then you see, how he. It's also interesting seeing how he interacts with his son and later other son versus how he interacts with his daughter. They're kind of like different types of interactions. He's very loving and caring with his daughter, and then with his sons, he's a little bit more standoffish, I think, in a lot of ways. But might have something to do with, we don't really see them interact before his daughter passes. We don't see him interact with his sons before his daughter passes very much. So anyway, all that said, it kind of like we get to see him move into being part of NASA, which I didn't know he wasn't like an Air Force pilot. I never knew that. So he was just like he was a pilot, like a private pilot, but he was an engineer, a scientist essentially, as opposed to coming from Air Force, Navy, that kind of a thing. So that was interesting to me. Number one, I mean, I'm an engineer, and I can see the way that his brain might work, and might work a little bit differently than someone else who's coming from, because you could consider like pilots as, I mean, the stereotypical pilot is more of like a jock, or more of like a, has a big head and has, maybe cockier than what Neil Armstrong comes across as. So it actually makes a lot more sense as far as his attitude in when he becomes a part of NASA. So we also get to see his Gemini 8, or as they call it, Gemini, which I never knew.
Yeah, what's that all about? Well, you said Gemini in the beginning, and I was like, okay, so I was born June 4th. Am I a Gemini?
Yeah.
And they said it 1,000 times, and so it has to be correct.
I don't.
But
Damien
I have
Chazelle
never heard
even
that
says it that way.
Yeah, but I have never heard it that way, ever. Not even like in a discussion. Not even any. And I know I'm not exactly an intelligent person. I'm not.
Well, don't say that.
Below average, but I'm somewhere average. But I know a lot of really smart people. And my brother is a colonel in the Air Force, and you're an engineer, and he's up for general, by the way.
Wow.
And so that's a huge deal.
Yeah,
he's huge. And so he's uber intelligent. And, you're an engineer. Your wife's a doctor. I mean, I know a lot of smart people, and I've never even heard a discussion. It's Gemini, not Gemini. I've never heard that ever. And I've seen a lot of space movies and a lot of astronaut movies, and I'm interested in that stuff. I watch all of those Sci-Fi Channel stuff. I watch all of Nova. I watch all the Nature Channel and Degrassi. What's his name? What's the
Neil deGrasse Tyson?
Yeah, yes, deGrasse, right. Okay, so that just right there proves my intelligent level. Anyway, the point is that I've never heard that. So when they were repeating it over and over again, and they've repeated it a lot, I thought to myself, well, that's got to be correct because they're not making a thing about it. They're not saying Gemini sometimes, and then people are correcting them. So did they say Gemini back in the day?
I don't know. It might be localism. It might be how certain areas of the country said it. When they do the 1962 speech, maybe it was a 1963 speech that JFK gave, where he's like, we will go to the moon, we will do this and other things in this decade, and it's like, what did he just say? Did he just say decade? It's decade. Like, who has ever said decade? So it may just be a way that people pronounce that particular word in their, local, I don't know, in their area.
But weren't there the news coverage of these events? They said Gemini too.
Oh, I don't know.
So did they not? Yeah, that was pretty good, by the way, your imitation of JFK. That was pretty good.
Well, it's Simpsons.
Simpsons. I'm certainly not anyone to talk about how somebody pronounced something because I have my own dictionary and I have my own language and I will say things and I create my own words. So, other than people's names, there should be a general way you pronounce things. And I get them wrong all the time. So when they were saying that, I was like, wait a second. I was born June 4th. I'm a Gemini. Why has nobody told me that word is not right? I was like, have I been saying Gemini my whole life and that's wrong? It's one day I'll tell you the story about my infamous monologue and the word infamous. I'll tell you about that story off podcast.
Whoa.
It's hilarious, actually. Yeah, it's very funny.
All right. Well,
and how I mispronounced it and I said infamous. And they thought it was a choice. And they said it was the best choice anybody made that day in their monologues. And I had no idea I was mispronouncing it. So there's that story. I just outed myself when it came to that story because I know people know that story too.
Wow. That's why it pays to talk to people because I've been caught in things like that. And I've seen other people just in conversation where, you read something so often and you just get used to reading that word. But if you never say it out loud or you never have heard somebody say it out loud, you can be totally wrong with your pronunciation of it. And I could totally see how somebody could read the word infamous and say infamous. That totally makes sense. That's not even a leap. But yeah, that's happened to me too, where you just read this word always, and then you're just like, oh, I had no idea that was how you said it. But okay.
Yeah, I know somebody who the Flatiron Building in New York, the very famous kind of triangle building that's on the corner, he thinks it's Flatiron. And no one is willing to tell him anything different because he is so convinced that's the word and he says it as if it's the word. It's interesting because I guess that's just part of being human because J.K. Rowling wrote in how to pronounce Hermione's name into the fourth book when one of the characters was mispronouncing it and then she corrects that character and now everybody knows how to pronounce it. And I swear, until I heard it pronounced in the movies, Hermione, I said a whole bunch of things in my mind's eye. And then when it's that difficult, I just skipped a word. That's what I did with the Lord of the Rings books. I just skipped the word after a while. Once I know the context of what they're talking about, and I can't find how to pronounce it. As a matter of fact, interesting that we're talking about this. Do you remember back in the day we were talking about Bobby Cannavale? You said, right. And one of us was saying Cannavale and one of us was saying Cannavale, and we went to pronouncenames.com and they said it different ways each time. And so they were just talking about that actor speaking. Strangely enough, he's in a play with Daniel Radcliffe, who played Harry Potter.
Crazy.
Yeah. 6 degrees of people's names here. And everybody calls him Cannavale. That's the first time I heard a group of people say Cannavale. So who knows? That's why Paul James is a pleasure, because I don't ever have to worry about pronouncing my name wrong or having anybody pronounce my name wrong. The only thing they do is think I should be called Jimmy, because they think my last name is my first name.
Yeah.
They think James is, yeah. But, what are you going to do?
Yeah, well, we said all that just to get back to the fact that we get to see Neil Armstrong in his Gemini 8 mission. And I knew the story behind this because I was turned on to a podcast called The Countdown, which I will now tell everyone to go listen to. Even if you're not like a huge space nerd, it is still a very good podcast. The Time Magazine made it, and it is, it's short podcasts, but they're all about different situations that NASA went through in each of these different. There was a bunch of times when there could be serious problems. There were times when there were serious problems, and people know about them. But issues with different missions like Gemini 9, Apollo 10, Apollo 12 even had some issues, but and they use archival audio footage from Capcom and the capsule communicator, the person on the ground who's in charge of talking with whoever's up in space, and then the audio from the guys in the capsules. So that is really well done, and it's really cool. So I kind of knew what was going to happen with the Gemini 8 situation, but being able to see it and see how they kind of dealt with that, I thought that was really cool. They also kind of allude to that in the training, where you see what Neil Armstrong has to go through in that 3-axis trainer, where they spin him around and stuff, and you just how quickly you can just pass out. And that is, it's amazing that they have the ability to focus, to have that kind of laser focus, to understand that it's you've only got one shot. In the trainer, you've got as much time and as you're willing to devote to this, to figure it out. But in the situation that they were in at Gemini 8, when they were had docked with the LEM and they were in a roll that they weren't able to, it was kind of like a compound roll that they weren't able to correct. That right there was, that is a serious issue, that you have one chance. And the fact that, someone with a different demeanor probably wouldn't be able to have handled that. So it makes me wonder if the closed off emotions and the internalization of all of the sorrow, stress, all of the things that he's dealing with allowed him, it put him in a position to deal with the emergency that was happening in Gemini 8 when it was happening, and it was able to be. He was the only man on Earth or in space that could have handled it at that moment. That's what makes me feel.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%, because there are clues to that throughout the whole entire film. We were talking about this earlier. We were talking about his motivation and why he does what he does. And, it's an often told joke now, what's my motivation? But that's actually a thing where, as an actor, you need to find out why you're doing what you're doing and what your motivation is. And because of the whole practice of different crafts of acting, it has now become a joke, but it's actually a true thing, at least for me it is. And so at the end of the film, I go, what was his motivation? You never hear him talk about why he wants to go to space, why he wants to be an astronaut. There's never a conversation between him and his wife. This is something very unsafe and uncertain. And now we have 40 plus years under our belt as a society that this is a norm now, that people go to space. And things often happen, and they've happened throughout the history of space travel, or the space race, or whatever you want to call it. But you're just not sure why he is doing what he's doing. And then it dawned on me, and we're about 45 minutes into the podcast right now, so we can go ahead and talk about this subject and not make it confusing to people who are listening who haven't seen the film. If you haven't seen this movie, I definitely say see it in the theaters.
See it in IMAX if you can.
Yeah, it's epic, but it's not. It's got this control to it. It's not this overblown spectacle that you're thinking it is. It's very subtle, so to actually see it on the big screen, you get to see the subtleties for what they are. And I'm not just talking about special effects. I'm not talking about going to the moon. I'm not talking about the first flight that you see. I'm not talking about any of those things. I'm actually talking about performances as well. So it dawned on me, when you see him at the end of the film, spoiler, and it's kind of a spoiler. So if you haven't seen the film, I would recommend going and seeing it and coming back and listening, because I don't want to give anything away that might affect how somebody's journey throughout this movie will play out. But if we talk about this, it might do that. So in the beginning of the film, when his daughter passes away, you see that he takes her bracelet that has her name Karen on it, which I find interesting that you never see the letters spelling Karen all the way out. You see a K, you see an R, and then you see an N, and you put it together as an audience member that it spells Karen, and it's this little girl's bracelet. And then when she passes away, you see him put it in a desk drawer. And this is what I find so fascinating about this screenplay. Everything that we've talked about, that simulator flight where he passes out, the bracelet, a conversation with his wife, conversation with friends, neighbors, conversations with neighbors, not necessarily with Neil Armstrong in the scene, but wife and neighbor and children and neighbor, all comes back at some point to support the narrative of this film. Then at the end of the movie, once he has walked on the moon, you see him walking over to this very large crater, and you're thinking to yourself, he's going to explore this crater. But that's not what happens. He reaches down and opens his hand, and in his hand is that bracelet, and he lets that bracelet go. It's a great moment. It's just really well done. And as I'm walking out of the movie, I'm thinking to myself, why did he do everything that he did? And then it dawned on me. He had absolutely no control over what happened to his daughter. Even though he tried to talk to those people about different medical care, you see, we talked about that scene earlier. You see that he tried to help her out. She's throwing up at one point, and he's helping her out. Of course, he would help her out because that's his kid. But that's to let the audience know that he has tried to do everything possible to save his daughter, as one would think a father would do. But it was out of his control. Him going to space and walking on the moon is something that had never been done before, that was in some form of his control. And that if he was able to triumph over something that should not have physically been possible, at least up to this point it wasn't physically possible, if he could triumph over that, then that was his way of letting the universe know, I have some control over my life, because I can do this, because you gave me something I had no control over. I don't know. It's just something I took from the movie, because why does he show that bracelet at the end? It can't just be for a sentimental moment. It has to be for something deeper than that. These filmmakers, it means more to them than just a cutesy little bracelet on the moon. It means something more.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing that I got from that was that, I mean, so he was, he has to process the loss of his daughter, and he has to understand that, there was a chance that his daughter could have survived her diagnosis of cancer. But it might not have been, it was probably a very, very small chance. But in the same way, like, even though we were successful in landing on the moon safely and getting everyone back home safely, there was a much smaller, or maybe there was just as small of a chance that all of that would have gone perfectly. And he contributed to the likelihood of that happening successfully. And that was a way that he was able to contribute to the history of humankind. The history of the United States, if you want to say that. But just the fact that it was so, I mean, the technology that we used to get to the moon in 1969 and land on it is so small compared to what we can do now. And the fact that they were willing to spend the time and energy and money and resources to do that, to, number one, prove that we could do it, I guess. But number two, to advance science in the way that it has advanced science so quickly, so rapidly. I mean, that also has to give him hope, because I can imagine Neil Armstrong as a human, as an emotional man, probably had very little hope after his daughter died. And this was something that he could isolate in on and could focus in on to give him hope in humans, to give him hope in science. I mean, a lot of the things that we've done in space are, healthcare related or disease related, to try to isolate certain things in healthcare and in medicine. And those things wouldn't have been possible without what we did in the Gemini missions and the Apollo missions and on and on and on. So all of that, I mean, it's really a legacy of his daughter that got him to that point and that pushed him forward.
Because of the circumstances of having a young child, and she was young, die of something you have no control over, even though you tried everything possible. And there are indications throughout the beginning of the film that that's what he's doing, that actually stepping on the moon he had control over. Yeah. And you're right, it contributed to all of those medical things in the future, but to actually say, hey, universe, I will take control of this. And I don't mean control in a negative way. I mean, I have to have some grip on the steering wheel of my life. And when you give a father or a family a child that is going to die of cancer, they don't have the steering wheel anymore. The doctors do, or the medical staff at the hospital does. You are no longer driving that car. And so for him to say, hey, I'm going to take it back, I'm going to utilize what I know to become this so I can step on the moon for the first time, it's a really subtle way of showing a man saying to fate, not this time. You got me the last time. You got us the last time. You dealt us a hand that we had no control over. Now we're going to take it back. And if you go back to everything that he's done up to that point and you apply that theory to it, it works, because that's what I spent the rest of the evening doing, going, well, if he did this, oh yeah, that applies back to him taking control. And I would like to go back and see the film again, maybe not in the theaters, but one day I will see it again. I would like to listen to the dialogue to hear what references are there that I might not have picked up. I picked up on them, obviously, because I got that out of the film, or that's what I extracted from the film. I'd like to go back and hear the actual dialogue and the subtleties that add up to that for me. I know they're there because that has to be, for me, that's what the film's about. The film is about that. So, yeah, well, it's interesting.
We kind of skipped to the Apollo 11 mission, but I will briefly bring up the Apollo 1 mission, which a lot of people do know about. I mean, we've never, as a country, we've never had any loss of human life in space in the astronaut program in NASA. But we've had multiple instances of disaster before people made it to space. And on Apollo 1, was the first huge disaster, was in the plugs out test, when they weren't even, I mean, it wasn't even the day that they were supposed to leave. It was just a, procedural test. And there ended up being a fire in the capsule and they weren't able to get out and they died. But I was wondering how they were going to deal with that. I knew from the beginning, just from being somewhat of a geek, that Ed White was one of the people in that capsule, and that's he's played by Jason
Jason Clarke.
And so I knew he was one of the astronauts in the Apollo 1 capsule. So I knew what was coming, and the fact that they put him in close proximity with Neil Armstrong. I don't know if that's true or not, if they were, friends or neighbors across the street or what, but I knew that was going to have an effect on the Neil Armstrong character in this movie. So I thought it was really well done, that it wasn't one of these Neil Armstrong is, sitting at home watching the football game and then he gets a call and this is what happens. The fact that he was, and I'm hoping this is historically accurate, the fact that he was at a White House dinner, kind of not hamming it up, but kind of like being a salesman for NASA to these politicians. And it's in a time when there was definitely some, opinions that we weren't spending our money properly when it came to NASA. Maybe that money should have gone to other things, but being an advocate for the space program and for NASA specifically had to be difficult, especially for someone like Neil Armstrong, who may not, isn't naturally, it doesn't seem like he's naturally a salesman or a jovial type of a guy or a real glad-hander type of a person. So that must have been difficult for him to begin with. And then the fact that he has to get this news while in that environment, and that, he has to deal with that separate from his wife, isn't able to really process that immediately with his family. And then at the same time, his wife is having to support Ed White's wife, Pat is her name, is having to support her during this time. I mean, it's a difficult situation, but I thought it was well done, and done in a way that was framed around the main character of the movie, and that was the key, because you can't not comment on it, but there's definitely worse ways they could have dealt with it. So I thought that they did a really good job with that. It also helped to motivate Neil Armstrong, I think, because you have some of his interactions with Deke Slayton, played by Kyle Chandler, where, he's pretty much like, we have to get this right. People are counting on us, and if the Apollo mission wouldn't have made it to the moon successfully, I feel that Neil Armstrong would have felt like he failed not only NASA and not only all the money that they spent to try to do this, but he would have also failed, Ed White's family. And because it's like, what do they have to show for this? What is the legacy of, Ed White and Chaffee and Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee and Gus Grissom? Like, what do they have to show for it? And they have a lot to show for it right now, because they were able to, that mission was successful. So it was one of those things where it's like, you can't let off on the gas, because there's a lot of people who are really, kind of counting on it. So I thought that was well done.
Well, it's also back to what we were just talking about, that death in this movie is a motivating factor. It is something that the lead character of this film, it projects him into the next step. Each time somebody passes away or somebody is no longer in the picture, it's a motivating factor for the lead character. And it's subtle, but it's there. And then I think when that fire happens and those men die, I think that's when Neil Armstrong I don't know if he finally realizes it, but he realizes that this is something that's going to affect his whole family if something bad happens to him. And is it worth it? Yeah. And I think that's why you see the scene with, and I believe the actress's name is Olivia Hamilton, Pat White.
Yes.
And she's great. That is a great scene. I think that's why that's in there, because it's showing how the family is as affected by these situations, and not necessarily the family who's somebody passed away in, but everybody else too. And that is sort of not a cliche, but that is sort of a box being checked off for a movie like this.
Well, you get those scenes in The Right Stuff too.
Yeah,
I mean, you get those similar scenes.
That's a great movie. I love that movie.
Yeah.
Sam Shepard's only Oscar nomination, deserved.
Huh.
Yeah, well, he has 4 Pulitzers, so.
And he wasn't even an astronaut. I
No.
mean, he played Chuck Yeager.
Yeah, I know.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a great performance. It's one of those subtle performances that I'm glad that the Academy recognizes, because we need those. We don't always need these huge over-the-top performances. We've talked about this often enough. But yeah, when the 3 men die in that fire, you now know the stakes are much higher as an audience member, but you also realize that not only the lead character, Neil Armstrong, and his wife, Janet, is her first name Janet?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Janet. It just pulls it closer to home, and it adds to the scene later on. That's what I'm talking about with this film. Is so subtle in the way that yes, it's an epic scene when the fire starts, and it's a devastating scene, and it's a larger than life scene, if you will. But it adds to the tension of that last scene with Janet Armstrong and Neil Armstrong, when she's like, "Are you going to talk to your kids? Are you going to talk to your sons?" And he's like, basically, "No, I'm just going to walk away silent," which is how I've been dealing with everything up to this point. And she's like, "Not good enough. It's not going to happen." Like, the possibility of you not coming home is huge. You can't leave your kids like that. And they leave it for his eldest son to actually have that conversation with him and point blank and say, "You're not saying it. I can see that you're not saying it." So the chance of you not coming home is there. And he never really answers that question until the son kind of presses him. And it's a beautiful moment. That moment would not have resonated as strongly with me as an audience member if it wasn't for all the other things that had happened up to that point. Seeing that devastated wife standing outside her car, I can't remember her name all of a sudden, Pat White, seeing her stand outside her car, just standing there, it adds to that scene later on, because as an audience member, whether or not you connect it, it's all right there in the emotional roller coaster of this movie up to this point. And you know that's a possibility for Janet Armstrong in the future. And she knows it too. So you talked about Claire Foy earlier, and we talked about not really knowing anything about her and how her role might have been a little underwritten. Here's the interesting thing to me. She stuck out so much to me that I think she went above and beyond what was on the page, and it is a borderline Oscar nominatable part for me. She has got something. You call it the it factor, whatever. They put the camera on her, and you can read every thought going across her eyes at any given moment. And that's really hard to do, especially when you don't have dialogue, especially when you don't have a lot of the character development that you get from the lead character and a lot of the other characters too. You learn a lot more about them than you actually do about her. But what's essential is not necessarily that you learn a lot about her, but you learn that she is doing her job as a mother and as a housewife, which is really hard jobs and really important jobs. And she's doing it because that's what she's chosen to do, not because that's what society has told her to do. You can tell she has chosen to be a housewife, and that's a really great thing. So to actually see her motivation in such subtleties is a really difficult thing to do. And I think she pulls it off hook, line, and sinker. As a matter of fact, when she's on screen, she pops and sizzles so much more than he does that sometimes I was distracted by what was going on with her versus what we were supposed to be following with him and the narrative. So she brought something intangible to this part. And she is the definition of supporting character. Her character is there to support the main character's narrative. And she made it as much about her and her storyline, even though it's not necessarily there on the page, than probably 100 other actresses who could have played that role. So whatever she is and all this hype that she's been getting, Claire Foy with The Crown, I understand it now because she just is amazing in this. And she's British, right?
She is.
Yeah, I Couldn't tell at all. You cannot tell. There is not even a twinge of it anywhere.
You should look up the trailer for The Girl in the Spider's Web, which has gotten...
I've seen it.
Okay. All right. That's her.
Yeah, I know it's her.
It's crazy.
I have a little bit of resistance to that, though, and we could talk about that later on. There's something about it that is not gelling with me. It's become this action-adventure, action hero thing in the trailer. And that's fine if that's where they want to go, but that's just not that story for me.
Well, it's not a Fincher film, I don't think. That's the big thing for me.
Well, the first three are not Fincher films either.
That's true.
So, yeah, it's a whole nother subject, and I'm sure she's going to be great in it, and she is unrecognizable in that. But I have, it's interesting. I don't know anything about her, but I know her when I see her. And so when I saw the Spiderweb trailer, I was like, wait, is that Claire Foy? I think that's her. And she's doing the German dialect, and she's pulling it off. So whatever, it takes sometimes a certain movie for me to recognize a name to a face. And that's what's happened for me for her in this movie. But people have obviously known about her for a while. And I'm good because she really puts in the work in this film, and it shows. And you're right. I think it's underwritten to a degree, but what do we expect from that? Do we really need a backstory? Do we really need the love story? Do we really need why they met? Do we really need her crying over her daughter's grave? We don't need any of that. The subtleties that are in her performance shows us all of that.
All right. We haven't talked about the score, but I think it is a really, really good score. And from the and I've been listening to it a lot, since I've seen the movie. And from listening to a couple of podcasts about the making of the movie, it's an interesting setup because the score was written by Justin Hurwitz before principal photography started. There were like animatics, because I listened to a podcast with the it was the On the Screen podcast. Hollywood Reporter does it, and they were talking about the visual effects supervisor, and he said that he got animatics, like these kind of like crude, storyboards, like animated storyboards, with the score on it, like that he was able to see. Yeah, so the score was already composed, and they overlaid the score to these, animated scenes. And so Damien Chazelle was able to send that to him and be like, hey, here's what I kind of want it to look like. Obviously things might change, but here's kind of the kind of feelings we're going for and the shots that I'm looking at doing. So that is an interesting little twist there. But I think that it's really neat, some of the instrumentation they chose to use. There's theremin in there. Have you, I'm sure you know what a theremin is, but yeah.
Star Trek.
Yeah, there you go. Or any kind of like, what was the Day the Earth Stood Still? They used it in that one, where, it's kind of like a early synthesizer type things. And they also used synthesizers too. And it was similar to, I think they're trying to, I don't know if he's trying to get the feel of kind of like early sci-fi movies, like late 50s kind of sci-fi movies, but he doesn't do it in like a kitschy way. He integrates it into an orchestral score that's powerful and that is also intimate. And I think the best way that they're able to make it more intimate is by using the harp a lot. And that is, it's a precise instrument, but it's also a really kind of like ethereal instrument too, kind of like space or, like heavenly or whatever you want to call it. I was trying to think, I'm sure there've been harps in other scores. Maybe they use harps all the time, but it did kind of stick out to me that was like the primary instrument in a lot of the pieces.
Now, was that something you noticed the first time you saw it, or because you've been listening to the soundtrack?
So two things. Theremin I definitely noticed because you're like, oh, look, it's theremin, but it wasn't like, it wasn't weird. It was well done. And they actually played the theme on the theremin, the same theme that they, went back to the same theme they had played on different instruments, harp specifically. So you kind of pick out the harp, kind of like how they, I'm not a huge fan of the Interstellar score, but I think it's Hans Zimmer, did it. And it's just like Oregon, like serious Oregon. And, you know, I understand why he probably chose that, but for me, it was a little off-putting. And I noticed it. But in this case, I think I noticed that the harp was, I think it was like, I realized it. I'm like, wow, this is interesting that they're using the harp as such a prevalent instrument in this, as opposed to just being a kind of a background like fill-in instrument. So I don't know. I do enjoy the score, and I know that it's blasphemy, but I think it should definitely be nominated for an Academy Award, and it should go up against your A Star Is Born.
Well, that's a different thing, though. I'm talking
score.
about the songs.
Songs different.
Yeah, but
yeah.
Yeah, songs different.
But score, it'll probably still be nominated for score, right?
And about 10 other Oscars, and if it doesn't win or doesn't get nominated for that over top of First Man, I'm okay with that. I'm not that obsessed,
Okay.
and I don't think it's blasphemy per se. I mean, I get the joke, but I mean, it's a category with 5 nominations, Josh. It's okay if other people are. So nothing else can be nominated except for A Star Is Born. And go ahead and nominate Bradley Cooper. Well, I mean, because there's like 5 songs in there that could be nominated. That's just a fact.
I read an article, they can only nominate 2.
Why?
That's a specific. It's specific to the Oscars, because it was one of those, like, they had to, like, last week, I guess they chose the 2 that they were going to nominate, because it's that people are starting to come out with their, like, for your considerations. That's a whole nother topic, because Marvel came out with their for your considerations, and Avengers Infinity War, the only for your consideration on there is visual effects. Everything else is Black Panther. Like, they don't want Avengers Infinity War to step on Black Panther, so they're not even going to try to get a whatever best actor for Robert Downey Jr. or something. They're not even going to try, because they're saving it all for Black Panther. So that's cool.
It's a safe bet. That's a safe bet. True. And actually, that's the right bet. Black Panther is superior in all of those categories to Infinity War. It just is.
Well, you have the ability to focus on one character, as opposed to Infinity War, which is just like a roulette wheel of characters.
Right, absolutely. And if you're going to finally get a nomination out of one of these movies, and you gave it to Robert Downey Jr. for Infinity War, or Tom Holland, or any of those people, you'd be like, yeah, that's like Monsters, Inc. losing to Shrek as Best Animated Feature. Although, Shrek was not Disney and Monster Inc. was, and for them to not win the first animated Oscar is bizarre. My personal opinion is I like Monsters Inc. better, but that's me. So, right, and I think everybody else did. I think they were just caught up in the Shrek thing. And now we look back and go, that shouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't have. But, in my humble opinion, there's a lot of people laughing at that. The point is that if you're going to nominate Chad Boseman for Best Actor, that seems like Chadwick. Well,
maybe his friends call him Chad. I'm not on a Chad basis with Mr. Boseman.
Okay, well, I've seen that movie like 5 times, and I've been promoting it on Twitter since the day it came out as not forgetting the Oscar nomination. So me and Chad are close. And you're right, it is Chadwick. Watch, he's going to do this interview where he's like, people call me Chad all the time, but I don't like it. I like to be called Chadwick. That's my name. Anyway, the point is that that's, in my opinion, a better nomination if you're going to talk about a performance from a Marvel film. It's a better performance. It just is. We were talking about score. That's where we're going with that. There's plenty of people that are going to nominate plenty of different things, so it's okay if First Man is nominated against A Star Is Born. And also, I think that 2-song rule is bull. Like, why? I mean, are they because of something like A Star Is Born coming in and having 5 songs that could easily be nominated, so they're afraid that's going to happen? That's actually a very interesting thing. They need to change that rule. They're going to re-examine that rule. Do you know what 2 songs that they're going to nominate are?
Yeah, so they're doing I'll Never Love Again, and then, of course, Shallow.
So we digressed. I would like to get back to one last point for me about First Man. There was this, I would say, semi-large conflict or controversy about Damien Chazelle not showing them planting the flag on the moon. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's
Oh,
not a thing.
here's what gets. It's not a thing. Here's why. It's not. Okay, let me calm down. I do not like when people come up with an idea about something that they've not seen.
Yes.
If you've seen the movie and you followed the movie to a certain degree, that is not relevant to anything in the movie. And there is a shot
Of the flag.
of the flag.
But
and
it
you
would be
see
out
it.
of place in the movie if they spent the time to do that.
Well, it goes back to what we said earlier in that there are no cliche shots of any of these events except for that one of them walking down the hallway. And I think it's appropriate that that's there because it is kind of something we're used to in astronaut films. You know, they're all bundled up in their gear, and it's complicated what they have to do. So to actually wear this big glass fishbowl over your head, it needs to be shown. So that shot is reasonable. Nothing else about this film says astronaut or space exploration film. Nothing. It's the reverse of what you're usually used to seeing. So if you were to see that, and it was probably even difficult for him to shoot the one small step for man scene, because how do you recreate that and not make it look like a cliche, or because it is a cliche at this point and it's a very monumental moment. So it's almost like, why bother? But you have to, because they mention it later on or earlier on in the screenplay. What are you going to say if this actually does happen? And it begs the question, what does this person who's got this epic moment, this monumental moment, what is he going to say? This guy who's so subtle in personality, what is he going to say when the whole world is listening? What they say, 400 million people are watching
500
it?
million.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. That's like the population of the United States. That's crazy. Anyway, so when you do see that shot of the flag, it's from far away, and it's when he's traveling across the moon to the crater, to the scene we talked about earlier when he lets go of his daughter's bracelet. That's what that scene's about. That scene is not about planting the American flag. It's not about patriotism. It's not about saying, yes, the United States got there first. It's about one man's journey that helps a whole bunch of other people. And to actually plant the flag and do that cliche, it would have drawn the energy away from why we were there to watch that movie to begin with. So why everybody had a hard time with it. And here's another thing that bothers me about that controversy is everybody's like, it's unpatriotic. It is not. First of all you do is see the American flags on their chest. He shoots that often, where that the American flag is a prominent part of the scene. And then when the spacecraft is first going up and he goes straight down the United States of America, straight down the side of the rocket, that shot is huge. Those letters are the size of the actual screen that we were watching it on. So if you can't find in there patriotism, and if you can't find the love of America in there, then that's a separate issue. It's got nothing to do with this movie. And let me reiterate one little part. I'm going to get off my soapbox. Okay, I'm off. It's about letting go of that bracelet, not about the American flag. Because this movie is not about America's race to be the first on the moon. It's about this one man's race against his own situation in his own life. That's why it's called First Man. It's not called First Exploration of Space. It's not called United States First. It's called First Man. So it would have, you're right, it would have taken away, it would have made it clunky. It would have not had a purpose. I loved what he did. I loved that it wasn't in the film, not for any kind of patriotism or anti-patriotism sentiment. I just thought it was about something else. And the fact that it was is what lit me up about this film. I will say this, I don't know if I said it enough. I think it's a Best Picture contender. I think it's a Best Director contender. I wouldn't be surprised if Ryan Gosling got his third Oscar nomination at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if Claire Foy got a nomination. I wouldn't be surprised if, of course, the special effects, the screenplay, I wouldn't be surprised if any of that happens. And And I wouldn't be surprised if it's the type of thing where Damien Chazelle is nominated, but nothing else is.
Yeah.
That happens sometimes in these kind of movies. But that said, it's one of those movies, and it's interesting to me because it's essentially what the movie's about. It's not what you think it's going to be about. I was not expecting to be so emotionally touched by a film and find it so personal when I thought it was going to be this epic over the top film. It's the polar opposite of what it is. It's an extremely well told movie, especially with Damien Chazelle and his energy. He's got this crazy kinetic energy all the way through Whiplash, all the way through La La Land. But when you start to break it down, he kind of does the polar opposite of what you're expecting. The opening number in La La Land has this not emptiness to it, but it doesn't have as much grandeur as an opening musical number traditionally has. It comes in, it comes out, it gets done, and it's over, and it says what it has to say. But it doesn't have this epic over-the-top thing. It's same with the whole sequence in La La Land with the pool and all that stuff. It does the polar opposite of what you're expecting it to do. You're not supposed to see what you're seeing. And his take on this film, Damien Chazelle's take on First Man, is an important one because it focuses on the human side to the story. And I think that's important.
Yeah, well, and so now I'm going to talk about the Apollo 11 mission and them landing on there. And that's when they kind of transition into that IMAX footage, which, like I said, I didn't get to see in IMAX or any kind of like an aspect ratio change or anything. But I was under the impression that they shot that like on a green screen, but then I found out that they like found this rock quarry that they were able to take like 5 acres of this rock quarry and turn into a, replica of the surface of the moon. And, they had, like a single light source, like the sun, and they were able to shoot that pretty much like practically. And they did some visual effects to take out things like when you have the shot of like multiple shots of, Neil Armstrong with his, visor on, and you see like all the reflections of, the moon surface in his visor. They had to take out all of the camera crew and, all that stuff. They had to remove all that digitally, but the actual Earth it's not called Earth. The actual moon surface that they were, walking on was practical, and they had them on, these, kind of springy type harnesses that made it seem like they were actually moving at 1/6 gravity, like that they were, were able to bounce and do things like they would on the moon. So I thought that was really cool that they did that practically. And the other thing I will say about that whole scene is that that's the ending where he goes to that crater and and throws his daughter's bracelet into the crater. That is not anything that's ever been either verified or denied by Neil Armstrong. The only thing that we know for a fact is that there was about, I think they said 11 or 12 minutes while Armstrong and Aldrin were on the moon's surface where he had his comms off and he walked away from Aldrin and towards that crater. And during that time, he had no communication with Aldrin or with Capcom or with people on Earth. So that time, those 11 minutes or 12 minutes, that was his time. And it's just amazing that he's all of these resources and all of this energy and all this money and all these people got him to a place where he was able to actually be alone, even though he was being, he had just been watched by more people than had ever shared the same experience in the history of mankind. And he was still able to carve out space and time for himself and for whatever he did, with his daughter and with his daughter's memory. So I thought that was absolutely amazing that, number one, that's a personal experience that he had. And number two, he didn't exploit that or he didn't even, share that with anyone. That's crazy.
So that's the film and screenwriter's interpretation of what possibly happened in that moment?
Exactly. Now, I don't know if it's in the book or not. I don't know if it's in the biography book or not, but it's definitely the screenwriter's interpretation.
And if it is in the book, it's a masterful moment. So if it existed and actually happened, it's masterful. If it didn't, the fact that somebody's creative imagination came up with that, and it solidifies the reason why the movie should be seen for me. This movie is about that moment for me. All the other epic stuff that we go through is not half as important as that one scene. And it's touching, and it touched people in the theaters. It touched me. It touched my dad. You could sense it. That scene with the son, the family discussion scene, people were just like sobbing, man. They were just like, what is happening? We weren't expecting this. So those type of moments will always rise above, for me, above any kind of CGI or any kind of special effect or anything like that, because they're human, truthful moments. And whether it's made up or not, it doesn't matter. It seemed logical to this movie and what could happen in this movie, because we're not watching a documentary. We're not watching what actually happened. We're not watching the guy talk about it. We're not watching the family members talking about it. We're watching an interpretation of the truth. And sometimes that could be more truthful than the actual events. So I love it. I kind of don't want to know if it actually happened.
Yeah, me too.
Because I don't know how that's going to affect how the moment in the movie made me feel. It's such a genuine, organic moment that it probably won't affect it at all. But it's just one of those things where I'd like to believe that's exactly what happened. And sometimes when you read the book, or sometimes when you find out the fact, it alters. Sometimes you find out that the actual event that really did exist or did happen is way more interesting than what the movie intended it to be. But this one is it's just pure movie magic with such human truth to it. It doesn't matter to me one way or another.
Yeah. All right. I think that's a good place to end it. So you can check us out on the web at actorandengineer.com. Go to facebook.com/actorandengineer. You can tweet us at actorengineer. And we'll see you next time.